Okay, well, let's go ahead and give a nice LA C# welcome to Dave Max.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. My name is David Max, as you know, and I'm going to be talking tonight about building real-time apps with Firebase and AngularJS. So I know we're at a C# user group, so a couple of questions for you guys. One, how many of you guys are familiar with AngularJS? Okay, so a few. Or just have any idea kind of what it is and what it does. Okay, so a few. And then how many of you have actually written code in AngularJS? Okay, so just a couple. So then I won't speed through that part. And as far as Firebase, how many of you have heard of Firebase? Okay, so, and I'll assume it's fairly new, so we'll just take it from there. So tonight, briefly, just about myself, I am a developer, and I work as a consultant in Orange County, California. And I, for the record, am not officially connected to Google or Firebase. I just dig their stuff, so here I am. And today, what we're going to cover is a few things. First, the what of Firebase, what it is and what it does. The why of Firebase, why it's important and how we got to this point. We're going to build an app using Firebase and AngularJS, and we're going to do some live coding, and that should be exciting because live coding is always exciting in all the wrong ways. And then we'll look at the what else of Firebase. It has some services attached to it that are helpful, so that should take us nicely into the next part. Before I move on also, from a C# perspective, do you guys do a lot of web stuff, like with MVC frameworks, or that's not something you guys are familiar with? Like by show of hands, if any of you guys worked with any JavaScript MVC framework? Okay, there we go. All right, so that helps me. All right, so I know where to start now. So first of all, what is Firebase? So it is a real-time application platform, and in more specific terms, you can look at it as an API that Firebase provides us to store and sync data. So imagine that there's sort of a NoSQL database living in the cloud, and you've got JSON formatted data that then is synced to devices from that NoSQL database living in the cloud in real time. So, and we'll talk about what real time means in a minute. It also has a set of services that allow you to do things like user authentication. So for example, if you're familiar with OAuth and things like that, if people have a Facebook account, you can log them in, Facebook, Google, Twitter, GitHub. It lets you manage security rules. It does it in a very simple way that's declarative using just JSON format. And so that makes things easier than you would if maybe you were doing the traditional database route. And it hosts files. It has very strong encryption, both for the data and for the static file hosting. That's 2048-bit encryption. So that helps sort of keep everything nice and organized and lets you deploy apps easily. So let's talk about the why of Firebase, why this is even relevant. If we go back and look at history of how things have developed over the decades here, in the 70s, we had mainframes, and users were usually using thin clients. So if you imagine an air traffic controller, or better yet, let's say a ticketing agent at the airport. You go to the airport, the ticketing agent takes your ticket, they type something in. What they have in front of them has very little processing power. It's just all connected to some mainframe somewhere. As we move into the 80s, we get personal computers. That's where all the action, all the processing power is going on the desktop. And that's where we get thick clients. When the 90s come around, we get this turn towards thin clients again. If you think of the web as a thin client, if you think of a web browser as a thin client, because all the heavy lifting is done on the server. The browser is just receiving data, basically. That's very little processing going on there. So today, we have sort of a hybrid of these things. Today, we have a connected thick client, and that applies to things like smartphones, tablets. And so the device in this case is doing some of the work, but not all of the work. And it also works offline. So the important point about the device doing some of the work is that you can distribute some of that load from the server off to your clients. Not everything has to be done on the server. Now that we have fairly high speed processors on mobile devices, we're no longer reliant on doing everything on the server, and that frees us up to do some special things. And it also frees us up to choose where, as a developer, we want things to go. Do we want the processing on the client, or do we want it on the server side? And we'll talk in a minute why things working offline is important, but I would just have you bring to mind Gmail. So if you think about Gmail and how you think of your regular email, you pull out something on your laptop, your email is there. With Gmail, now we're moving towards things working offline, but that's sort of where we're going with that. And this is typically done in a request-response model. So you're sending requests to the server, getting things back, and processing some of the data that you get back. So the question that we often get when we talk about this is it really real time? Of course, in computer networks, there's no such thing as real time. So what do we mean by that? In this case, we mean that changes to one client are synchronized to all the clients that are subscribed to that data within milliseconds. So milliseconds is basically what we mean in real time. And that's, I think, maybe as close as we're going to get for today. If you're trying to gauge the scale of that, you could imagine that if you went into Firebase's data centers, you would see that at any given time, there are 1 million concurrent connections syncing data to and from Firebase. So there are, imagine all these, again, those NoSQL databases with all this JSON data, and at any given time, there are 1 million simultaneous connections. And something that's happening now is interesting in that Firebase has now become part of the Google Cloud platform. And that's exciting to me because I feel that now we have the Google Cloud infrastructure to back up Firebase and allow us to continue to keep these promises of hundreds of thousands, millions of clients syncing within milliseconds, because it's sort of a tall order. Why does all this matter? So if we think about being application developers in America, we're pretty used to data moving fast. We don't think about what happens when the network is unavailable or slow. And one of the things that happens is the app and the user fall behind. Their data is now out of sync with the rest of the users of that app and then the data on the server as well. So that doesn't sound like such a problem until you consider the developing world. So as globalization continues and markets open up in Asia, we can't ignore those populations that are moving at a slower speed. So imagine 65% of all mobile connections, all mobile data connections right now are working over 2G or slower. So what Firebase does is it provides us an easy way to sync with the local cache of data on a mobile device. And that way, two things can happen. One, the user can keep using the app when network conditions are bad or slow. And again, I would point you back to something like Gmail or Google Docs. What happens when you lose your connection? Or chat, for example, any type of chat, WhatsApp, Facebook. What happens when things get out of sync? Do you completely shut the user off? How do you keep them in sync? So in this case, they can keep using their local cache of data, and then when network conditions improve, Firebase seamlessly syncs them back up. Three-way data binding is how this is possible. So we'll talk about what that means bit by bit. Three-way data binding is easiest to imagine as combining Firebase with something like an MVC framework like Angular. So you would imagine that data binding, just the way we think of it as you have some data in memory and you want to sync that data with your DOM, with the document object model that is HTML. So you imagine Facebook, all of your personal data is being synced into the HTML that you see on the page by data binding. It's bound to that data. So Angular does this two-way data binding thing very automatically. So it takes data that it has in memory and it syncs it with the data that's in your document object model seamlessly. That's true to varying extents with different model view controller frameworks, but you can think of it that way. And I'll show you a diagram in a minute that might help you understand this better. But data in the DOM is syncing with memory, and then now we add this third dimension of data binding, which is Firebase. So now we have data going in all directions. So let me show you what that looks like. First, we start with two-way data binding, and in this diagram, Angular. So we have on the left, we have the DOM, that's our HTML. Data there is being synced by Angular with memory, which in Angular we call scope. So that happens pretty much seamlessly. And it's very convenient because prior to this, if you were using something like jQuery, you had to write all this by hand. It didn't just happen. With Firebase, we're now adding a third dimension to this, which is that data in memory now syncs with Firebase as well. So when changes get made in any one of these locations, all the other places get synced up with that same data. So that lets us do some interesting things. It lets us keep things in sync between clients. And today that's important because you imagine most people have a smartphone, a tablet, and a laptop. They're moving around, and we expect those things when we log into our Gmail. We expect to see the draft that we wrote 2 hours ago to be there, or we expect to see the messages that we've already read marked as read still when we log into a different device. So that kind of gives you an example of why that's important. So when it comes to building an application, a lot of apps today are just moving data around. They're just performing a series of CRUD operations. Now, at first blush, that might seem like a oversimplification. But when you boil apps down into their component parts, you're really just moving data from one place to another. And at least a lot of apps do that. Be it in the enterprise, you could be moving enterprise data from one place to another. Or let's say in Facebook, you're moving your profile information from one place to another, or your user data from one place to another. So in these situations, Firebase combines this real-time messaging and notification layer. And then on top of that, it has a data persistence layer. So it's doing two things at once. It's persisting our data, but it's also syncing our data. And what that lets us do is we can write front-end apps with no server-side code. And that sounds a little bit too good to be true, but in a minute, I'll hopefully demo that for you, and you can see that it does, in fact, work. So speaking of which, it's fairly easy to integrate. Firebase, it works with all the major JavaScript MVC frameworks like Angular, Backbone, Ember. It works with hybrid mobile frameworks like Ionic. It works with native applications, iOS and Android. And it has setups for REST and things like that, libraries for REST and Java as well. So it's fairly easy to integrate with whatever you're doing. So as far as today, what I thought we would try to build is an application that I dreamed up where in a situation like this, you guys could ask questions of the speaker, and I would see, or any speaker would see those questions presented in real time, and I could choose to include them in my talk. And not only that, everyone else would see what questions had already been asked. So I'm going to build that using just pure HTML5, CSS, and AngularJS tied to Firebase. So we're going to try to prove that no server-side claim and build an app that is something similar to a chat app. It's syncing in real time. It's a real-time app with no server-side code. And it might even be useful. We don't know. So we'll see what happens. So I'm going to go over to a code editor called Sublime that is a favorite of mine, fairly popular these days. And so I have two files here. I have an index.html file, and this is just pure vanilla HTML. There's nothing special here. There's not even, there's no Angular here either. This is just HTML. I took this from Twitter Bootstrap. Is just a template for styling things, makes it easy. So there's really nothing special. I'll explain to you what the parts are as we go. And then I have a JavaScript file, meetupbase.js. And this is the basic components of any Angular app. And so for those of you who are not familiar with Angular, just to give you a quick preview, this first line on line 1 is what we're going to bootstrap our app with. This is the main module of our app, and it's called Meetup-Base App. And below it, we have a controller. And in Angular, the controller is a place where we can control views and put a lot of business logic into control views. So what we're going to end up getting from this is something that looks like this. So it'll be some type of little chat application here. What I've done just for time and helping you understand what you're looking at is I have hard-coded in this first message that you see. My name is Dave, and my question is what? So if we go look at the HTML, we can find that. And here it is. And so we have an unordered list. And within that unordered list, there's one list item. And within that list item, we have my name, and it's strong because I like it to stand out, and the question. So that makes up what you just saw. Now we have to make this actually dynamic. So because not everyone here is familiar with AngularJS, I'm going to start doing the Angular part, and then we'll add on Firebase as the next sort of dimension to this. We'll start with the two-way data binding, and then we'll add in the three-way data binding. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell Angular where we want it to pay attention to. And in this case, we want it to pay attention to HTML element in our DOM. So we're just going to use what's called a directive, and I'm going to say ng app equals Meetup-Base App. So now Angular knows this is the important part. Then we can go and we can drop in our controller. And again, this handles views. In this case, I'm going to be attaching it to the body element, but you could attach this to any element you want to control the view of. It could be a div, it could be anything. So you could have multiple controllers on multiple divs in one single page application. So in this case, we'll just attach it, and we'll use the ng controller directive. And again, I'll just drop that in. So now what we need to do is we need to tell it what we want it to do with that stuff. So we need to say, hey, Angular, you see this list item. I want you to repeat this for every piece of data you see. So for every entry in our database, for every name, for every question, I want you to repeat this list item over and over and over again. So I'm going to use Angular directive called ng repeat. And what I'm going to tell it is for every question object in the questions array, repeat that. So it knows that it's supposed to repeat that list item element for every item in the array that it finds. So if you want to see where that comes from, we'll go take a look at our Angular. I've created this array, questions array, and I've put it into the scope. And so it's a global variable at this point. And I've just filled it with 2 elements, both of which are objects. And they're just key value pairs. The key is user, and in this case, the first value is Dave. The next key is question, and the next value is what. So we want Angular to go ahead and bind to this data and go ahead and display it in our view. So this is where the two-way data binding comes into play. So right here, we're going to put in what's called an expression. So we put these double curly brackets, and we can say we want our question object, and we want from that the user. And over here, we'll put another expression to display the question itself. Again, we want question object, and we'll say we want the question. So if I've done everything correctly, we should be able to go back into Chrome now, and instead of just the one question that I hard-coded, I should be able to refresh, and there. Now we've got two-way data binding. So you see, these 2 elements of data came from AngularJS. So that's your two-way data binding. And we'll get deeper into it, but you can see how easy that was. Pretty easy compared to the old way of doing it. So now let's go back into our Angular, and let's wire up the 3rd dimension. Let's wire up the 3-way data binding. So I'm going to get rid of not the array itself, but just the contents of this array, because I wanted to start getting this array data from Firebase, not from what I've hard-coded in. So I'm going to reference the Firebase module, Firebase, and I'm going to tell it that I want it to look at a Firebase reference that I'm going to create in a minute called Firebase ref. And then I want it to take that data and run the asArray method on it. Because remember, the data is not in an array already. It's formatted as JSON. So we need some way to make it in the format that we want it. And this is what we call a synchronized array. And that's important when we'll get deeper into this. This is not a regular array that you think of in JavaScript. And I'll talk about the differences between a regular array and a synchronized array. But it has to do with the fact that if we had hundreds of thousands of users writing to one single array, if you got IDs confused, you could all be overwriting at 1 second the same element in the array, and that would be bad. So Firebase has figured out a way around that. So what we need to do also is Angular has something called dependency injection. So I need to tell it that I'm depending on that Firebase module that I just put in. And those modules are sort of like the module you see at the top here. So I'm going to tell it that it should look for the Firebase module. And I'm going to tell the controller that it also needs to look for the Firebase module. This is called dependency injection. So I'm injecting dependencies on these modules. And in 1 second, I can show you where that module comes from. So now that we've got that in there, I can show you that these modules, these Firebase modules, are just script includes in our HTML. So if you look here, the first script include is something that's common to all Angular applications. This is the Angular library itself. So in my head element, I've just put this minified version of Angular, and it's being served off of a CDN, a content delivery network. So I'm not hosting it locally, and that's done for performance reasons mostly. The next one comes from Firebase, and this is common to all JavaScript applications that would be using Firebase. And you can just go to firebase.com and you can download this along with a lot of other, let's say, helper libraries for Firebase. And one of those is another one that I've added down here, which is called AngularFire. And that provides some of the boilerplate code that we don't necessarily need to borrow from Firebase, but they've written it for us. So don't repeat yourself is the rule. And so we're going to let them handle a few things. So that is where I'm getting this as array method from. And we'll talk about why that's important. But first I want to show you.
So how that dollar Firebase is defined? How does it know it's a dependency on actual script number 2 or 3 in your body?
That's where the dependency injection of Angular comes in. So up here in the main module where I told it, look for Firebase, it's looking over here. Is there any script that I can find a Firebase module? So when the HTML loads initially, it goes ahead, it reads through all these scripts, and it finds there a module called Firebase. And then from there, it realizes, okay, I've got not only this module, but I've got some methods there as well.
But I'm talking about more like scope question. Not
Oh, okay.
Because how does it, so that means one of the scripts, number 2 probably is defining that dollar Firebase inside its JavaScript. That's not my question.
Yes, exactly. Here, right? Yes, you're exactly right. So the script, this script number 3 actually, yes, on line 15 is defining that helper method. And we're going to use one more of those. And I'll show you now. Let me go into our browser and we'll see. Hopefully this should connect up. So our data will probably disappear because there's no data. So that means we now need to stick some data in our Firebase to actually look at. And I'll show you how that works. So in Firebase, it's really easy to create new Firebases and new apps. So for example, I'm just going to say C# sample. Okay, and then we'll create a new app. Am I spelling this? Is C#? Okay. I don't think I can use. All right. Okay. There we go. There we go. Good point. C# LA sample. All right. All right. So create a new app. So there we have it. It's already there. And all I needed to do to create this account was just show up at Firebase, give them an email address, and tell them what I wanted my password to be. They don't even verify it. They just hand me a database. So it's pretty easy to get your hands on. From here, now I have the root level of C# LA sample. And what I want to do is I want to add a sample question. So we'll say the first one could be called question 0. And from there, we'll use key value pairs again, user, in this case, Joe, and Joe will have a question. He'll say, who? Now, before I add this, just look over to the right, and you'll notice that there is a key here, a legend, and it has different color coding for different operations. So when I go ahead and hit the add button, you'll see that the data that I've added is going to turn green, and any nodes that have changed are going to turn yellow. And you see there's also red for deleted and blue for moved. So there we go. That pops right in there. And so now we actually have some data. So now that we have this, we can go back to our Angular and we can plug this in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a trip over to that code, and I'm going to say that I want the Firebase reference, this reference right here that is passed as an argument to the Firebase module. I'm going to tell it that I want that to be a URL. That's basically what we're talking about, is the URL. So we'll create a new variable, fbref, and we will assign it a new Firebase object, and we will pass that a string. That string, easy enough, just comes from right here. We can just grab the string right out of the location bar of the browser. That's the location of our Firebase, and we'll drop it right into the code. So we'll drop that in and save, and then hopefully now we should maybe see something show up here. So there's our data. So now we just are seeing three-way data binding. So that data is coming out of the database, going to Angular, syncing with its memory. Then Angular is syncing that with the document object model in our HTML, and it pops up here fairly instantaneously. So if you want to see this in action, you could see that I could then come in and add another question. So I'll say, all right, let's have one more. Let's say question 1. And question 1 is going to have the same user. And we'll say Dave. And the question will be how. All right, and you'll see things will turn green. But if you look to the right, you'll see this data show up instantaneously as soon as I click the add button in our app. So there it is. So you can see any changes that are made in Firebase are bound to the memory in Angular, which is bound to the document object model, and it all synchronizes within milliseconds.
So does it cache already locally somewhere in the app or not yet?
It's in scope, but it's not locally cached. No, you have to write a little bit of extra code if you want it locally cached.
So if you would change that URL to break it a little bit, that would not load anything, I assume, right? What would happen if you break
Yeah, if I change the URL, that would break it. Yeah, that would break our
how
connection.
do you see? Can you show us what would happen with the page? Let's go back to the code.
Oh, sure.
And the FBref change break that URL.
Here, so for example, we'll take off the .com, right? We'll just use it as dot. And if we come back over here, we'll go ahead and refresh this, and it's empty. So you can see, that's something common is people don't really believe that it comes from, they think there's some magic behind the scenes. And when I first saw it, I had to admit, I was pretty amazed. So there you go. So now I've added in the .com. And while we're on the topic of URLs, I should show you that every piece of data in Firebase is its own URI. It has its own URL. So for example, we look at question 0. Now, this dashboard, which I should tell you, by the way, is called Forge. Now we're looking at just question 0. You can see that up in the URL here. If I wanted to look at just the question, I could go right down to that. And if I want to, I could even just type in .json onto this, and now I have the raw data itself. So you could see where this becomes powerful for creating endpoints in your applications. And I'm not a C# guy, but I would imagine that this is probably the way you would use it in C# is the raw data, because you don't have all these MVC frameworks going on.
Yeah, in the REST way.
Yeah, something like that. Yes, you would use it in a REST. Go ahead.
Then, so since you show us that way, in a nice way, name it kind of, you take the responsibility of naming the actual record is kind of presumably some sort of ID, like question 0.
Yes.
So if you would to, or your app would to add new one, then you have to figure out how many records you have.
Yes.
What is the new number?
That's right, and I'm glad you asked that question, because that is where we're going next. So that is exactly the right question. We're on the right track. So these are called push IDs, or you'll see push IDs is the answer in these synchronized arrays. So what I'll do is let me just show you what happens when I wire up the code. What I'll do is I'm going to put some code into our Angular that will actually write in a new question from our app, not me sticking it into the dashboard. And then you'll see what how it handles that. And the answer is it's going to give it a very random string to identify it by, called a push ID. And that's where we get into these synchronized arrays. That's why we can't just have array element 0, array element 1. If we all tried to write array element 1 at the same time, because the app thought that was the next one available, we could all overwrite each other's data. So that's exactly what we need to figure out.
Is there a possibility of random generated thing will get a duplicate and they will overwrite the previous value? I mean, 1 in a million chance. Is there something?
I don't know the statistics of it, but I would imagine that I would imagine.
It might happen.
It could, I mean, statistically, that is possible. I mean, there's really nothing that it could be totally random, but I think that,
Like a good, right? Yeah,
well,
literally not happen.
yes.
Based on time and math, so grid is really solid, but anything else,
Right.
I'm worried.
So you'll see that you'll see how long of a string we get, and you'll see how random it gets, and then you can, yeah. So it might be. So I don't know what the actual statistical odds, but I think that if you consider that 1 million devices are syncing every millisecond, you could imagine that's a lot of hammering. I think there's about 130,000 users right now, or developers using this. So it's fairly widespread. And now, like I say, now that it's part of Google Cloud Platform, I think that anything like that, they're really working hard with the Google Cloud infrastructure. We have a lot of computing power behind us to back us up on things like that. But it's a good question, and it's something I've thought of myself. But at least they did think of an answer, because if you couldn't do what you're talking about, then we'd really be in the water if we had to handle it ourselves. So we'd really be stuck without an oar. So let's go ahead and look at how we'll handle that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our HTML, and in here I have input elements. So these input elements are the input fields where you write your name and you write your question. So what I'm going to say is that I want to attach a directive called ngModel. And what that does is it sort of associates that input with a variable in scope. So I'm basically creating a variable on the fly here without talking to my JavaScript. I'm just telling it, figure it out. And Angular is nice like that. It will just do it. So I'm going to tell it that I want this to be name. And then I'm going to go down to our other input element, and this is the one where we type in our question, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to give it the ngModel directive, and I'm going to tell it I want it to be called body. So again, I'm just creating variables on the fly that are living in scope. Can you guys see this all right? I'm not sure how we are on projection. Yes, I certainly can. So it might change the justification.
Across the screen, kind of hiding the code here.
Oh, down here?
No, yeah, this part, the gray bar. Right?
Oh, the gray. This is just the bottom of.
Oh, so there was another code. Okay.
Yes, another set of code back there, just in case we needed it. I was playing with putting this in closures because that's the way you're supposed to do it, but we'll leave that out for now, just so we don't get confused. All right. So here we are. So we need to now. So back to our model. So we just put in this ngModel. So now I've told Angular that I want 2 more variables on the fly. I want one called name in scope, and I want one called body in scope, so that when people type in their name and their message, their question, I have someplace to put them. And I also need to create some type of event, because I need to know when to submit this data. So I'm going to use another Angular directive called ngKeyDown. And I'm going to assign ngKeyDown a method that I haven't written yet. I'm going to call it add question, because that's what I want it to do. And I'm going to pass as an argument an event. And I haven't told it what that event is going to be yet, but between me and you, it's going to be hitting the enter key. So basically, to make it short and simple, you enter your name, you enter a question, you hit the enter key, it submits the data. So now we have to actually write that method. So we'll come back into our Angular, and we'll say scope.add question, and then I'm going to assign a anonymous function, and I'm going to pass an argument of E, and that represents the event that we just took in. And then I'm going to tell it that if it's true that the key code that is passed happens to be 13, which is ASCII for enter, then what I want it to do is go ahead and add the questions by adding them to this array up here, this scope questions array. So I'll just say now scope questions array is going to call another one of these helper functions that we get from Firebase, and that's add. And so instead of using a typical array method like push or something like that, we'll use add, and that again has to do with the synchronized arrays and the unique IDs. And we'll see how that works in just 1 second. So I'll tell it that I want it to add an object, and that object is going to have key value pairs user, and where it's going to get the value of user is from those variables I created on the fly, those models. So in this case, scope.name is what we're getting from the first input. And then in the next case, question is the next key, and it's going to get that from scope.body. So now we can hopefully see what it will look like when we add in one more thing I'd like to do before we leave here, just for good measure, or I'll explain why I do this in a second, but after I type in my question, I want the field where we type our question to go blank again. So I'm going to use Angular's two-way data binding to just tell it, when you're done, just stick in a blank string, and then that'll blank out the question again once we've entered it. Go ahead.
I have a question here. Is there a way there should be, instead of hard coding checking for key code 13 here, we can make it durable, reusable method by maybe by submit button too, both by enter and submit. Can you use like filter expression in Angular on the text box to actually do that?
Yes, you can. You can actually. Angular has a whole set of data validation features that are sort of built into it.
So you can pick up the same method actually.
Yes.
By two different filters on two different text boxes and submit button.
Yes, you could. Something like that. And you could also, if it was specific text and you wanted to check, is this an email or something like that, there are directives built for that specific purpose that you don't have to write. They've already got it there for you. So hopefully now, if we go back into Chrome, we refresh the browser, I should be able to say, Dave, does it work? Question mark. And there you go. And so if you look what happened over at the other side, you could see that it put in a push ID for us. And this is what we were just talking about. This is, instead of my naming convention of question 0, question 1, it gave it this random string as the ID. And so that answers your question of how do you handle this. I don't know the statistics behind that, but I know that it is about, I think, as random as you could make it. And then from here on in, this is what we're calling synchronized arrays. And so I have a slide here to talk a little bit more about synchronized arrays. So as we mentioned, we get these helper methods from Firebase to help us implement these things called synchronized arrays. And they are to avoid collisions like what we were just talking about if we have a sort of simple naming convention. And because we're using names that it gives us, data that it gives us to represent each object, we have to do some special things when it comes to arrays. So you should use you don't have to use a synchronized array, but anytime you want to use something that you're going to iterate over or sort, and it needs to have a unique ID, that's when you want to use the synchronized array.
So question,
go ahead.
If you request that as array to be retrieved as sorted, who does the sorting, Firebase server or the client?
You can put hooks into Firebase, and so you can have it do some sorting, but you can also tell Angular that you wanted to pull down the data first and then order it in a special way depending on what your needs are. So I created that array, that synchronized array, with that as array method that we saw, and I'll go back and show you where it is. But it just makes sure that it's sorted in the same order as the records on the server out of the box. There's other ways to do it, but out of the box, it's the same order as you see on the server. And the synchronized array is assuming that you are using the helper methods and not your own array methods like push and pop and all that kind of stuff. And what it creates are those random strings, which are called push IDs. And so now we can go back and we can look at Forge. This is the push ID, this string here. And again, this also has its own URL. And from there, that data also has its own URL. And again, we can do the same trick and say JSON, and we get the pure data out the other side. So at this point, we'll just check that it actually does do what it's supposed to do. And so let's type in another question. Okay, now. And it seems to be working. So now what I'd like to do is move on to a couple other features of Firebase that I talked about in the beginning. And the first one of them is the hosting. So if you've ever worked with secure assets when you're developing on the web, it's a bad idea to mix secure and insecure assets on the same page. You'll get one of these errors. Sometimes if you're browsing, you'll notice like some error message about, oh, this page is mixing secure and insecure assets. So that's one reason why it's nice and easy. Rather than throwing my static files up on my HostGator site or something like that, I can put them on Firebase and host them there. And it also eliminates some cross-origin request issues. Question?
There's something wrong with the order. I wasn't sure if you...
Oh, yes. Well, the reason it's doing that is here. Let me show you. This is because we're mixing our synchronized array and the one that I built for it. So that's a side effect of...
But you said it's the order we see here on the server, right?
Yes, except the first two questions are ones that I manually put in that don't have push IDs. So when
the question is, they did it in the order that we added? Maybe that's...
Or they mean when it comes to a synchronized array.
Yeah.
So, but it doesn't count my two inputs, my two objects of question 0 and question 1 as part of the synchronized array because they don't have push IDs. So it just ignores them. So just to give you an idea, I could just say, okay, no more, get rid of my sample stuff. It all turns red and then it disappears. And then we can go back to the app. And now we can say order. Okay. And now you start to see it ordering correctly. So there you go. So now we are going to try to deploy this to Firebase. Now, if you've ever worked with EC2, Amazon EC2 or anything like that, it's a little bit of a pain. That's why Heroku got very popular, which was sort of like a cloud offering from Salesforce that let you deploy apps to the cloud really easily. This is sort of like the next step of evolution of easiness for developers in deploying applications. So I am now in my working directory, and all I have to say first is Firebase init. And just by the way, I've installed, using Node, I've installed some tools here from Firebase that allow me to do this. But that said, Firebase init, it will go ahead and think about it for a second. And then it will tell me, all right, you have these apps to choose from. And ours was C# sample LA. Do I have that?
C# LA.
Oh, there we go. I knew there would be something wrong there. LA sample. Okay, so there we go. So let's see. All right, and it's suggesting that we use the current directory, and I like that suggestion, so I'm going to go ahead and tell it to go initialize this. And in a moment, it should come back and tell us all we have to do now is give the command Firebase deploy. And it'll think about that for a minute. And now I can just say Firebase open. And now our app, C# lasample.firebaseapp.com is live. And if you guys have devices that are connected, you can hammer on it. But that is deploying the app. That's all it took, was a couple commands. So those static assets, my index.html, my meetupbase.js, and some CSS files that I added in there are now deployed to Firebase in the cloud, but not as part of my database. They're just static file hosting. And so let me go into the dashboard called Forge.
How do you know what directory to pull the files from? You just said Firebase init, right?
Oh, it asked me, do you want to use the current directory? And I just told it yes. So you could tell it that you want to use a different directory if you wanted to. But in this case, it just assumes that's its suggestion, and I took it. So we'll go back over here, and we'll look at some of the other things. So what we just looked at was hosting. And so you can say that we've just deployed this version. If I had deployed more things, you could see that with these menus, you could literally roll back to different deployments. So if you deploy something and you don't like it, you can roll back to other versions. And now we can move on to some of the other things that Firebase does for us. So now that we're here, what else does Firebase do? So we talked about user authentication, like OAuth. So if you have a Facebook account, or you want your users to be able to log into your app using Facebook or Twitter or Google or even GitHub. Security, it handles the security of the data using a declarative system. We'll look at that. It's just JSON, but it's much easier than what you'd be used to if you were some kind of DBA, I imagine. I'm not a DBA. It also has something called a Blaze compiler, which is their own sort of proprietary system for creating very complex security rules. Because some people look at this and they say, really, all I have to say is .json, and then my data is right there. So in this case, I do have authentication token that's allowing me to do that, but still, I'll show you how that works. And hosting, static files and app assets we just looked at. So let's go ahead and go quickly back to Forge, which is our dashboard. And so here's the data. Here are the login and authentication features. So for example, let's say I just created my Facebook developer account, and now I want to enable Facebook authentication for my users. I could just check this box, drop in my Facebook app ID, drop in the Facebook app secret. These are all secret to me. They live on the server. They're not exposed to users. And well, you could authenticate users through any of these methods. Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, Google. You can create your own custom solution, or you could just use regular old email and password, and it will manage all that for you.
For Facebook, why you need to put your Facebook something account?
Oh, well, like so.
You need to authenticate users, so you're getting credentials from the user in some web pop-up box or something.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've ever gone like to I don't know, a lot of apps these days, it'll say like, do you want to create an account, or you just want to log in using Facebook?
No, I don't understand why you need to put anything for Facebook here.
Oh, because
do you need to create a Facebook account for that purpose?
For that kind of thing, if you want to authenticate users into your application, you have to go and you have to get not only a Facebook account, but you need a Facebook developer's account, because normally what's happening is they are then sharing user data with you. So once they have authenticated, it depends on what you ask for, but at the very minimum, you get their name, their picture, maybe their friends, and things like that. So, and that's in that little pop-up window. If you read it carefully, it'll tell you what each specific app is asking you for. And so Facebook just likes to keep track of who's asking for what of their user data. We talked about the security rules. This is the most basic form of that. So on this particular Firebase database that we've created, these are the rules. So I just have some JSON, read is true, and write is true. Now, obviously, if you're writing a real complicated app, you would have to take it much farther than this. But one thing I should mention while we're on the topic is that if you have business logic that you don't want exposed to the user, while we're on the topic of security, you don't have to do it in this no backend code way that we just saw. I mean, essentially, I've just written a chat app with no backend code, which would normally require socket IO and a bunch of complicated things. So that's pretty impressive. But sometimes you might have some proprietary business logic that you don't want exposed to the client. And so in that case, like I was talking about earlier, you can put hooks into Firebase, and that will allow you to abstract away that business logic layer to behind the scenes. So back to these Firebase security rules, not only can you create them, but you can simulate them. So for example, if I had created some type of authentication system where I had users and I was giving them IDs, some integer, and it had to do with their provider, let's just say, for example, I could use this example and say, okay, now if they are user ID 42 from provider anonymous, authenticate, and I'll see what happens. That way you avoid trying to build an app and then pen test it yourself. You can kind of see what you've done, what does work and what doesn't work before you deploy something. Analytics, this is where we can just see bandwidth over the last 24 hours, bandwidth over the last 30 days, how much data is stored, concurrent users over the last 24 hours. And then finally, we already saw the hosting, so there is a way to use custom authentication using JSON web tokens, which is a complicated subject in and of itself, but if you know what that is, you know that you can use them here. But that pretty much does it, and I think we will open it up to Q&A, and we'll see. Maybe some people are even using the app yet. It looks like, yes. Sam. All right, thank you, Sam. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
When you went .json at the leaf level,
right?
If you step up a level and go .json, you get like a JSON object there.
Oh, so you mean if I went from right here?
Yeah.
Yes, I'll show you how that works. So there you get the object. Yeah. Anyone else?
Can you show us how those, where those the static resources, how you can retrieve it from the
It's something that if you go into the command line, you can find you can manipulate at a more granular level the static assets. You can't see them here, no, for whatever reason. It's not designed through. You can't see them like you would a file manager in your host or something like that.
But the same with push IDs. I want to say like the questions. I want to see the same tree basically using that. Can I read that?
Right. You can't see it from within the dashboard, but you could use the command line to do it, unfortunately. But who knows? They might add that in the future. I'm not sure. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Are you, do you know C#?
No, actually, I'm totally unfamiliar with C#. So that's why it was actually Lionel that had come and he saw me talk at SoCal Code Camp LA. And so he invited me here to talk to you. And I asked him, are you sure that C# people would be interested in this? Because I'm not sure this is up their alley, but he assured me that you would. So
I'm actually interested, but I'm like, I've been learning C#. I'm not a super developer, but
right.
I can. So what was your path to learning HTML5 and JavaScript and JSON, all of that?
I had a background in sort of front-end development. I used to work for a division of EMC, or it's now a division of EMC. EMC is a big sort of like a cloud services provider, one of the largest. And for them, I did all of their client-facing web stuff, and then I also started building these intranet applications. And oddly enough, I sort of got my taste for building web applications when we were using Salesforce, the software, before it had become Salesforce.com, which ironically is one of the competitors to EMC in the cloud space. It's one of the biggest. And they had told me that they were spending something like, I think like $18,000 or $20,000 per license per year on Salesforce, which is this software that would just let their sales team stay up to date with contacts and all this kind of stuff. And I said, and the problem was we had to mail back laptops, in order to sync them, you had to physically sync them. You could not do it over the internet. And I said, that's ridiculous. Give me the database and a DBA, and I will write a web application, an internet application, sort of software as a service. And this is in the year, I don't know, it's a long time ago. But I told them, I'll write that. And so right there, I think we had, I don't know, 20 salespeople or something like that. So we saved them a big chunk of change like that. So that's kind of how I got started in it. And then more recently, as far as AngularJS and all these things, I was sort of just getting into JavaScript. And the thing that sort of spurred my interest in JavaScript was I used to hate JavaScript, actually, because it annoyed me, quite frankly. It was slow and it had all these sort of compatibility issues until Google came out and they sort of rebuilt the JavaScript engine. They came out with the they called it the JavaScript V8 engine, and that sort of ushered in this new era where JavaScript is so fast and powerful enough that you can use it on the server side. So all of a sudden you had a lot of people moving towards this idea that if you know JavaScript, you can write full stack applications. You can be a full stack developer, write the server side code in JavaScript and the front end in JavaScript, and that allows you some flexibility as to where you put things. You can decide, do I want this on the server? Do I want this on the front end? And not only that, you're familiar with the code of the whole thing, including the database. So that's what sort of drew me in. So that's how I got started with it. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
2 questions. How long are you going to leave the sample up?
Oh, I will leave it up indefinitely.
Okay.
And I will also provide, let me go here. I have some resources for you guys here. I don't know why I keep flipping through here. So a couple things. First of all, the sample I will make available along with the slides on my blog, and I'll give you a link to that. It's davemax.com. I'll give you a link to that as well. Also, if you want to sort of try this, there are libraries for REST and everything else. So if you could easily implement a REST solution with C#, I imagine. So the hacker plan is free. It supports about 50 users simultaneously connected. The Candle plan, which supports, I think, 200 simultaneous connections, I have 1 month free trial activation codes that Firebase sent me. So if you guys want one of those, just let me know and I will give you that and you can get started on that if you want to scale up a little bit. So just ask me for an activation code. And if you want to learn a little bit more about Firebase, you can just go to their website. You'll see there's a How It Works button and a Getting Started. It will then sort of guide you in if you're doing REST or you're doing native applications or you're doing web applications. It has them sort of nicely separated out. So it's not all JavaScript. It's not all Angular. And then if you want to see some of those other libraries, you'll find them there. And you can link to them directly from here. But like I said, they do have helper libraries for REST. The same way I was using helper functions to implement the synchronized array for JavaScript, you'll get the same thing for REST or for iOS if you're doing Objective-C or something like that. So you can find me at davemax.com. That's my personal blog. And you can also find me on Twitter at davemax. So just drop me a message and I can get you the activation codes and answer any questions that you have also if you think of them afterwards. And you'll also find the code and the slides here as well. Anyone else? Oh, yes.